Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel, and welcome to another monthly reading wrap-up where I share with you the books I read this month. July was a better reading month for me than several of the previous ones. I not only read more books, but it was a month of research for me. I read a few books that were research for my second 1920s mystery, which I am currently writing right now. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The first book on this list is Legacy of Steel by Matthew Ward. This is the second book in the Legacy trilogy. I really liked the first book, which is Legacy of Ash, and I have a video on my channel dedicated to a review of this book if you'd like to check it out. Legacy of Steel I also have a video dedicated to. Unfortunately, I did not like it as well as Legacy of Ash. In Legacy of Steel, we pick up with events about 1 year after Legacy of Ash has ended. The Hidari Empire is once again attacking Tresia, and Legacy of Steel is basically just one big long campaign. I did not really enjoy this book. I found it to be overly long. It's really not any longer than the first book, and yet the pacing was a problem. Because it is just one big long campaign, it felt repetitive and boring at times. There are a lot of characters involved with this book. There were also a lot of characters involved in book one, but in book one they were mostly concentrated in the same areas. In book two, that's not the case. The characters are spread all over the place, and by the time you get back to one character, 200 pages may have passed, and it's hard to remember where they were and what they were doing. All in all, I did not like this book. Yeah, that happened. There's a helicopter spraying crops just outside. Honestly, this is exactly what I get for dilly-dallying and waiting this late in the day to film this video. So where were we? Legacy of Steel. I didn't like it. I thought that nothing really made sense. There were world-building issues in the first book that I had hoped would be resolved in this book and just never were. In fact, the world-building became more confusing as ever. The various gods in this world become involved with the war between the Hidari Empire and Tresia, and that just complicates things further because these gods are not really well developed, their powers are not explained, their motivations are not really explained all that well. It's not explained why they choose to give certain gifts to some characters and not others, or why those gifts affect characters differently either. Honestly, the magic system in this whole world is a bit of a problem. Again, it was developed enough in book one. I kept waiting for it to be developed more, and then it just never was, and I really did think that we were going to get more development in the second book and for it to actually make sense, but that didn't happen. In fact, it made less sense than ever. Certain characters escaped death a lot of different times in this book, where you were finally going to die, and then they were saved by some improbable plot device, and it was really convenient and also frustrating. And then the characters who did die came back to life at certain times, so death doesn't ultimately mean anything in this book. All in all, I was just really disappointed with it, and I have serious doubts if I will be reading the third and final book. Next we have Calling the Spirits, A History of Seances by Lisa Morton, and this is one of the books that I did for research. There is a seance that happens in my book, and so I wanted to know, how did mediums go about conducting seances in the 1920s, and this being a whole history of seances actually covered far more information than I needed, but it was a very fascinating read, and as you can see, if you can see the little tabs at the top, it was a very useful book to me, which is always good. It's what I look for in a research book. I don't want to read a book and then it turn out not to be useful to me at all. I learned a lot of interesting things in this book, and it's really ironic to me how people fell for seances in the past. It's kind of ridiculous, some of the things that mediums did, and then people just thought that they were genuine. It's very obvious to me as a skeptic and as someone who lives in the 21st century that these mediums were complete frauds, and I don't understand honestly how people fell for them. And I'm kind of contending with that in my book for a little bit as well. And the only real explanation I can think of is that the people who fell for these mediums the hardest are people who just wanted to believe that there was an afterlife and that they could contact their dead loved ones through these mediums. It was really interesting to learn the various methods that mediums used throughout history. The spirit knockings that were really popular in the Victorian era were actually caused by the medium making the bones in their feet crack, which only certain people could do. It was a skill you apparently had to develop early on in life, and I guess if you didn't get it when you were young, you missed out. So that was really interesting. You had things like table levitations. Some mediums pretended to hack up ectoplasm, which was actually just cheesecloth and various things like that, or egg whites, which I think is really weird. And again, I don't know why so many people fell for it, why they didn't realize it sooner. Some of the seances were just flat out bizarre. People described people floating. This one guy, I believe he went out the window and he floated. And I'm just like, how did that happen? Like, personally, I don't believe in seances. So I think that all of these people are probably lying or else taken in. Like, even if they believe that what they're saying is true, I think they were fooled. But I admit I don't know how you fool that. Like, and this was in the Victorian era. So I don't know how they could fool floating like that. And then other people claimed to have seen floating instruments playing by themselves. Of course, these various things were often debunked, but some of these accounts in this book are truly bizarre. So if you find seances or the supernatural, or you just kind of want to learn something that has a little bit to do with Halloween, which is coming up, I recommend this book. Next up, we have Veiled Warriors, Allied Nurses of the First World War by Christine E. Hallett. This is also a book that I read for research for my book. I have a character who was a nurse in the First World War, and so I wanted to know what it was like to be a nurse, where they were specifically for her, being from a specific country, where she might have been stationed, the things that she might have seen, what battles did she encounter, and this book was very useful as well. I found the introduction chapter to be a little bit dry and slow, and of course the chapters that have things to do with the war that my character personally did not or could not experience were not of personal use to me, although as a history lover I did find it useful. The accounts in here are very graphic and gruesome because they're often taken from diaries that were written by the nurses themselves, so it's a first-hand account of what they saw and what they went through. And, you know, they had situations where they were basically holding pieces of people together. They had to triage patients where they basically went down the line and determined who could be saved, who needed to go into surgery immediately, who could not be saved. And I just think that that must be an absolute horrible thing to have to do. To basically, it's not up to you who lives and who dies, because if this soldier was wounded so badly that there's no hope of saving them, that's not your fault. But you do have to deal with the aftermath, and you have to basically say to this person, there's no hope for you, I'm sorry. Are you done? So I do think it definitely helped me get a better feel for my character and the things that she went through and the things that she saw, which ultimately led her to making the decisions that she does, and is definitely a part of who she is now. War in general is horrible, but I think World War I especially was just horrible in general. You had the trench warfare, you had people dying for only inches of ground, only to retreat later on and give up that land that they fought so hard for. And you can see how the soldiers were definitely frustrated. They felt like this was pointless, it was meaningless, why are we even here, why are we doing this? Which I think is pretty common in war. It's a common sentiment. You have commanders that are kind of out of touch. They may not even be here, but here are your orders. We're supposed to take that hill. Go take that hill. It doesn't matter what it takes to get there. In particular, I thought it was interesting that both sides kind of adopted the mentality of war of attrition. They believed that if they just continued to throw men at the problem, it would be solved more quickly, and the more men that they could throw, the quicker it would be solved. Obviously, that this resulted in mass casualties. So yeah, all in all, I found this book to be very helpful, and I recommend it to anyone who needs to do research on this particular topic or is a history lover like I am. Next, we come to The Murder Stone by Charles Todd. This is a reread for me. I have read this book once before and I really liked it, but I had not read it in a couple of years, and so I wanted to reread it now. This is a psychological type thriller that takes place in 1916. Charles Todd is known for his World War I novels, and this takes place during the middle of the war. The main character, Francesca, has had all of her cousins killed in the war. She is an orphan and she lived with her grandfather and her cousins, and they grew up at this big house in the country. And the murder stone is a large stone that was half buried in the ground in the back garden, and they just fondly called it the murder stone. They liked to reenact battles when they played, or witch burnings, or executions, you know, things that little boys might find interesting with their kind of macabre imaginations. When this book begins, all of the cousins have died in the war, and Francesca is the only one left. Her grandfather recently suffered a stroke, and he has now passed away, leaving Francesca to deal with remains of his estate and the funeral, and she's very overwhelmed. This is obviously a blow to her because she loved her grandfather very much. In the midst of all of this, which would be hard enough to deal with on its own, a man comes to her claiming that her grandfather is responsible for killing his mother. His mother disappeared many years ago and she was never found, and he firmly believes that Francesca's grandfather killed his mother, which is an absolutely shocking thing for Francesca to hear. That does not align with the grandfather that she knew, but as she begins to uncover his estate and realize that there were secrets and things that he kept from her, she begins to wonder if she ever truly knew her grandfather at all. And if that wasn't enough, other people start arriving, claiming certain things, claiming to be certain people, and Francesca sets out to find out the truth, but the truth might be more dangerous and horrifying than she ever expected. This is a pretty slow-paced book. It takes a while to uncover what's going on. It's not your typical mystery in which there is a dead person and the mystery needs to be solved here and now. If there is a dead person in this book, it is the man's mother who went missing, and he believes that Francesca's grandfather is to blame for her death. And so they don't have a body. They have no actual proof that she is dead. In order to find out what happened, they need to dig into the past rather than the more imminent present. So things do take a while to unfold. It's a bit twisty. It's got lots of developments in it. I really like this book. I think that the antagonist is particularly unlikable. I do remember the first time I read it, the only thing that I could really remember was that I had this searing hatred for the antagonist, and that is not something that happens often. I don't usually feel such strong emotions when I read something, so if a book can make me feel those emotions, I know it's a good read. I enjoyed this book on the second reread as well, and I recommend it. Next we have The Girls of Murder City by Douglas Perry. This is a book that I did not intend to pick up when I went to the library. I just happened to catch a glimpse of it and I thought that it looked like it was the 20s, and it was. And while this book was not particular research for the exact mystery that I'm writing right now, I thought that it would be research in general for my series as we move forward, and I might get inspiration from it. And I'm not sure that I got inspiration from the exact murders that this book covers, but it did give me a lot of interesting information about how things were done in the 1920s. So this book is about the female killers who inspired the musical and later movie Chicago. The original play, Chicago, was actually written by a former newspaper reporter, Maureen Watkins, who ended up covering these female killers and their trials. A lot of these women were accused of killing lovers or boyfriends. They were cheating on their husbands and then they ended up killing their lovers, and now they're in jail. And it wasn't like a cleverly thought out murder, it was more like a crime of passion or opportunity, so obviously they were caught because they're not particularly clever. But what they're banking on is the fact that all male juries, because juries were all male at that time, do not like sentencing women. They don't want to give women the death penalty. So the women relied on their beauty and their feminine charm to basically be acquitted for these crimes, and some of them got away with it, some of them didn't. What struck me as particularly sad was the racism that was apparent at this time. One of the women was an Italian immigrant, and because she wasn't white and she wasn't an American, quote unquote, they happily threw the book at her. Now, her story does have a happy ending. Her lawyer, who was a woman lawyer, by the way, which took up these women's causes and championed them, which I thought was particularly interesting, she managed to get a happy ending for this woman so that she wasn't killed. But if you weren't white, your chances of getting off were not very high. Which is unfortunate. I mean, I don't care what these women look like. If they're murderers, they should probably go to prison. And some of them did, and eventually the sentiment turned against these women killers. The men were no longer going to fall for it, and this was also a pivotal thing in eventually getting women onto juries, because women felt like they needed to be on juries because they were not taken in with these women killers the same way that the men were. Maureen Watkins, the reporter, certainly wasn't, and she was very disappointed when some of the beautiful killers got off scot-free, and she was disillusioned with that. So that is what eventually inspired her to write the play Chicago. It was this biting satire where no one truly wins, and it was just meant to demonstrate the decadence and corruption that was Chicago. I mean, Chicago was referred to as the murder city. Some people were offended by her play. They felt that it celebrated bad behavior and criminals because the criminals got away with it the same way they did in real life. But Maureen was adamant that this is the way she wanted this play to be. This is the story that she wanted to tell. And even though a lot of these women got away with it, they didn't have very happy lives. Some of them thought that they could go to Hollywood and get a film deal out of what they had done, but that didn't pan out for them. Their marriages and relationships fell apart. Some of them didn't live very long after that, and then some of them who did were just alone after that. So even though they got away with murder, these were not very happy people. And unfortunately for Maureen, after the success of her initial play, she couldn't really regain that same success. Chicago just blew up, and she never really achieved the same fame as she did with that play. But all in all, I thought it was an interesting look at the real life stories behind the play. I've never seen the play or the movie, I just know a little bit about it, but it was just interesting to see how things played out back then, and it definitely gave me some things to think about. And last but not least, we have Beautiful Little Fools by Jillian Cantor, which I just finished very recently, and I have a video solely on this book. My opinions on this I expect to be a little bit controversial, but that's okay. Not everybody has to agree, and I think sharing opinions is important. And since this is a topic that I felt very strongly about, I went ahead and made a video on this book. But if you didn't know, this book is a Great Gatsby retelling. It markets itself as telling the events of the original from the points of view of the women in Gatsby's life, specifically Daisy, Jordan, Catherine, Myrtle's sister, and Myrtle herself, although Myrtle plays a very small role. However, this book differed drastically from the original. I wouldn't have minded if it stayed true to the original and just presented the events through Daisy's eyes and tried to flesh her character out a little bit more. I think if it had done that, actually, and ignored the other women, it would have been a better story altogether, because of the women involved in this story, it's Daisy's point of view that I most care about, that I find would be most interesting to read about, how she felt about Gatsby's sudden reappearance in her life, and all the various things that happen. I thought the book started out quite well, but when it started diverging more and more from the original, I didn't like it. I think that just because you can make a retelling doesn't necessarily mean you should. I don't have a problem with retellings, but I do think intent is important. If an author is making a retelling simply because they think the original is trash, they think they can write it better, or they want to remake a story in their own image, then I think it's wrong and I don't agree with it. However, if someone wants to write a retelling because they want to flesh it out a little bit more, or they want to tell a prequel or a sequel, then I think that that's different. Again, if this book had stayed completely true to the original while telling it through Daisy's eyes so that we get to know her a little bit better, I would have been fine with that, because the original is told through Nick's point of view. We have no idea what Daisy might be feeling about any of this, other than what she chooses to share with Nick, and that's only providing that she's telling the truth. So I really thought that it would be interesting to see all of this through Daisy's eyes, but it just diverted way too much from the original for me. It didn't stay true to the original, and it just took one too many liberties for my taste personally. For example, Daisy is not the one who kills Myrtle. It's Gatsby. He purposefully steers the car into her, whereas in the original, Daisy very much is responsible. Whether she did it intentionally or not, who knows? And that would have been an interesting thing to explore here, but actually it's Gatsby that kills Myrtle instead. He claims that he was trying to help her swerve, when in reality he's gaslighting her and he actually hit Myrtle on purpose. In the original, Daisy is the driving, and it's just Gatsby who takes the fall for it. I actually forgot to mention this in my video, but Jordan is the one who kills Gatsby at the end, not George the mechanic. And he did that because it was his wife that was killed, and he believes that Gatsby was driving and not Daisy. But in this book, Jordan kills Gatsby. I can't even remember why. And Catherine and Daisy and George are all there when it happens, and Catherine actually kills George. So that is completely different, and that was the biggest departure by far that I did not like. Gatsby is supposed to be a tragic figure. He and Daisy loved each other, and then life circumstances separated them, and Daisy ended up marrying someone else, and by the time Gatsby reappeared in her life with enough wealth to offer her a comfortable life like what she was used to, she had already become involved with someone else, and it's sad. In the original, they still love each other, they still care about each other, and in the end, it's just tragic because it doesn't work out. In this book, though, Gatsby claims to love Daisy, though we see no evidence that he really loves her, more like he's obsessed with her, but she does not love him anymore. So in this book, when he's killed at the end, it's like he gets what he deserves. And it just completely loses that tragic element. There's nothing in this book that makes Gatsby great, unlike the original. And so I was just really disappointed with this book. It wasn't what I thought it would be. I didn't think that it would diverge so drastically from the original, and I'm just not a fan of those kinds of retellings. So there you have it. Those are the books I read this month. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!